Hey, y'all. Appreciate you tuning in to the Theology Mill from wherever you find yourself today. In this episode, I welcome back Colby Dickinson for what I think is another very fruitful conversation with him. If you haven't had the chance to listen to the prior episode we did with Colby, which was back in September 2024, in which we kind of discussed his book on hauntology and continental philosophy, be sure to check that out. You'll find it under the title Hauntings in Western Thought. Again, that was from September 2024. And if you don't know Colby, he is a professor of theology at Loyola University Chicago, and his work focuses on the intersections between contemporary continental philosophy and theology, especially exploring kind of modern varieties of political theology and philosophy of religion. He's written a number of really excellent books, including ones on Giorgio Agamben, on apophaticism, and most recently another on pilgrimage as a kind of a complex personal phenomenon. So we do discuss that latter one, the one on pilgrimage, which is a book called Sacred Pilgrim, Secular Pilgrim. We discuss that in some detail in this episode. I'd encourage you to find a link to that book in the show notes if the conversation piques your interest. And as always, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time to listen. Here is my conversation with Colby. We hope you enjoy it. Okay, so I am very excited to be welcoming back Dr. Colby Dickinson onto the Theology Mill. We're here to talk today about his newish book with Cascade called Sacred Pilgrim, Secular Pilgrim, A Roman Journey. It's a very interesting book. It's a little hard to categorize. It seems like it's kind of partially a travelogue, maybe partially kind of memoir. There's, it's a philosophical text in a way, kind of also social and political commentary, particularly on Rome and Roman history, but also, of course, a meditation on pilgrimage. So I wanted to start, Colby, by maybe just asking what led you to write this book in particular. Like, what was its origin story?
Yeah, and thanks for having me here again. I would say the origin story is that I was asked twice to teach courses on pilgrimage in Rome for Loyola's Rome campus, and I thoroughly enjoyed doing that, so much so that I delved so deeply into the history of the churches, of pilgrimage itself, of like Roman pilgrimage, the seven pilgrim churches of Rome, and just all these little tidbits of history that were fascinating to me and to my students. And we would walk around the city, we would look at things, we'd look at the art, the architecture, we'd talk about the history of the church. And what I discovered was that, teaching a class on pilgrimage in Rome is such a perfect interdisciplinary topic because there's no way you can avoid even things you would think are not related: the food, the history of religious orders, how light falls through the windows, Caravaggio and paintings. And just there's so much that becomes active in a person's imagination when you're looking at the churches of Rome. And for me, that was my entryway into so much more because I went through so many personal changes during the time I was teaching those classes. And I thought, if I'm going to write about this, I really can't separate myself, my life, my faith or lack thereof with what exactly it is that the pilgrim represents in general, but then also specifically in the context of Rome. So that I sort of discovered too that if I'm going to be discussing the idea of pilgrimage from both, let's say, secular and sacred perspectives, I'm going to have to invoke that wealth of interdisciplinary, heritage with me, because I'm sort of defying categorical boundaries. I'm transgressing them very overtly, and I'm going to have to deal with that. I'm going to have to face that, and so I happily did so. And that was a big piece of what I was, getting into with this book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned this already, right? That's the sort of provocative title, Sacred Pilgrim, Secular Pilgrim. So I wonder if you could maybe say something about sort of that tension or that kind of dialectic between sacred and secular, and maybe in your work in general. But that might be too big of a question. But maybe even more kind of zooming in, like, what is this? What has that tension sort of meant in your own life, and then how does it feature in this book in particular about pilgrimage?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think in the book I tried to represent three different aspects, let's say, of that tension. One is the students I teach. Like I am at Loyola University in Chicago, and it's an amazing place with a beautiful campus, and we've got wonderful students. But of course, like a lot of universities in the Catholic world or just in general, we're deeply, split in the healthiest, most productive ways. But we have a lot of students who are religious, obviously a lot who are Catholic, but a lot also who are Muslim, and a lot of Hindu students. And then we also have students who are, not religious. Perhaps they weren't raised in it, or perhaps they are disaffiliated at some point, or maybe they're staunchly atheist. And so I'm always trying to bridge those gaps in my classes. How can I present this material in a way that's interesting, but also edifying to all these audiences, the different backgrounds that students are coming with? So that's one facet. The other one is
Mhm.
that if you visit Rome, I mean, yeah, it's just chock full of religious history, and Catholicism is on every corner, literally, and the churches are everywhere. But then you've got tourism, and you've got,
Mhm.
capitalism, and the shops and the marketing, and you've got, fashion and the food, and these things that ostensibly have nothing to do with, the sacred life. But how do you go to Rome as a pilgrim and not be lured into all, the
Yeah.
mayhem of the capitalist ethos and the tourist factions, the buses of Chinese tourists fighting and jostling to get somewhere? Like, how do you
Mhm.
avoid some of that, but also find a moment for quiet and respite and integrity of a spiritual life in the midst of that? And then the third piece is myself, right? I'm someone who even says to my students, I think it's okay to say I feel like I'm devoutly Catholic from breakfast to noon, but then from 1 to 3 a.m., I feel like maybe I was an atheist. And then
Yeah,
from 5 to 6, I was, then I felt like I was kind of in the middle, an agnostic. And I don't have a problem with that kind of fluidity. I think it's very realistic, and I think a lot of us need to be more honest in acknowledging that to ourselves. And that's
mm,
part of what I try to represent in the book from my own perspective. That I'm someone who feels extremely comfortable and wonderful within the Catholic tradition and all that entails. But I'm also someone who doesn't really always identify with that tradition.
mhm,
Um,
mhm.
and at Loyola, I teach classes on the history of Christianity and mysticism, and I'll teach classes on atheism and secularization at the same time. So I deeply feel like I'm always representing something like the crossroads of those things. And so for me, this book was really a demonstration of that, but also an attempt to represent tensions that really can't be represented because we're all just sort of caught in them and trying to figure out our best way to go through life, while doing this.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. So that kind of fluidity in your faith, I mean, would you say that's been kind of a development in your own life? Is that something newer for you, or have you kind of always felt that way?
I think in some ways I always felt that way. I sometimes trace it back to the fact that I was raised by a Methodist minister. My
Mm,
my parents were
mhm.
always, dragging us to church. And I think when you see your parent preaching from the pulpit, and then you see quote unquote the real them after
Yeah.
church, you develop like an inherent skepticism, or let's just say a critical eye, where you're like, I heard you say this, but I see you do this. And I think as a kid that always led, for me at least, to being somewhat skeptical or having critical questions about what faith really entails, but then also at the same time feeling deeply at home in it. Like that's my domain, that's my realm, which again is very familial, and I have no problem saying that. So I love being part of a religious atmosphere. There's so much of benefit there that I find so redeeming. Um, and I don't say that as someone who's going to follow it up with a complete, but I'm not really part of it.
Sure.
I no, I am. And I'm one of those colleagues who talks about let's make sure we're playing up our Catholic identity, and let's make sure we're reaching these students, and we need to have active spiritual lives on campus. But again, it's something that personally at times I'm a little more distant from, and I'm
Mhm.
okay with that too. But I'm also involved in it at times too. So
Yeah.
it's a complex thing, right? I mean, I don't think
Sure.
faith is always a simple thing. I think it's a very complex, subtle, and refined thing. I'm thinking of Bruno Latour wrote a wonderful book called Rejoicing about the torments of religious speech. And in there, he says something like, I think religion is the most subtle and complex thing, in the world. And I think to simply give it a quick endorsement or dismissal really does no justice to the complexity of what it entails. And I'm very much a subscriber to that idea. So I have no
Mm.
problem saying I'm Catholic, even if I can have no problem saying at times I'm an atheist. They both kind of go
Yeah.
together.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah. No, I'm interested too because I grew up evangelical, and then in my mid-20s I joined the Catholic Church. So I'm curious, kind of, what was it for you, having grown up Methodist, being the son of a pastor, that kind of attracted you to the Catholic faith, or what kind of led to that conversion?
Yeah. Many things, but I have no problem saying it was the people I knew who were Catholic, and they were pretty
Hmm.
cool. And
Yeah.
I like the way they held their faith, so to speak. When you're in Rome and you're sitting with some other theologians or priests or nuns, and you're drinking wine on a beautiful piazza, expounding on the mysteries of faith. That's a nice thing to have, like
Hmm.
to be part of your tradition. I liked how there was a respect for tradition and for the teachings of the church, but also a deep, deep heritage that it draws from, which really provides itself as a corrective. It's like if a contemporary, Catholic culture in a particular nation state, for example, and ours is certainly one of these right now, if it tends to get a bit extreme with something,
Hmm.
here comes the magisterium or a pope or just hopefully a bishop or even a priest in a parish or a wonderful nun who teaches the faith. Hopefully these people come in and say, look, let's not go to extremes. We've got a strong background here telling us you can't deviate that far, and there are reasons for that, and these are often beautiful, beautiful reasons, even if sometimes they can feel like constraints and need to be re-examined or challenged. But
Yeah.
at the same time, they can also be something that's wonderfully corrective to the excesses of a person's faith or short-sightedness, or however you want to phrase that. So those
Yeah.
things spoke to me, and I began to dig deeper into so many things, like the Pontifical Biblical Commission's documents on how to read the Bible.
Hmm.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
people would say are very boring, but when you read them, you're like, this is a really balanced, nuanced document. Like
Mm.
I didn't realize how this or so many encyclicals of popes could be just wonderful teaching tools that spoke to me very deeply. So that and the fact that when you went to mass, it wasn't focused on the other people who were there, which is what I was used to in the Methodist world.
Mm.
Like, it's a social hour and let's all get to know each other, which can be great. But I was very moved by the fact that people went to Catholic mass to be focused on the Eucharist, to be
Mm.
focused on their internal life. And that spoke to me profoundly then. It still does now.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, yeah. No, thank you for all that. Yeah, no, we've definitely seen the whole corrective piece like on full display recently. I would say with the Pope's kind of peacemaking approach and not being shy at all about calling out the American administration at the moment for not taking that kind of peacemaking approach, and even it kind of as a corrective to like a lot of the Catholics we're seeing in leadership in America, right? Who don't seem to be offering that corrective at this time.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, so I want to talk about how this book. I mean, it's like as we said before, it's kind of in part a story of your own pilgrimage, but it's also in part kind of a commentary on pilgrimage as such. So I wonder if you would say kind of how you would describe pilgrimage, and what does it kind of mean for you to be a pilgrim and to go on a pilgrimage?
Yeah, it's such a difficult question to answer in a way because obviously a pilgrimage has an end goal, so to speak. There's a place you're making your pilgrimage toward, and again, being raised Protestant, I was well aware of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. There's this idea
Hmm.
that a pilgrimage doesn't have to be physical in a location. It can be a spiritual experience or journey that you're making. But it can also be, in the Catholic tradition, quite wonderfully, an actual thing that involves your body. It's physically an embodiment of maybe the struggles you're going through. I think, for me, what I discovered in doing this was that yes, pilgrimage has a goal, so to speak. Maybe you want wholeness, or you want encounter, or you want relationship, or you want love, or however you want to define this, right? A lot of people go on pilgrimages for very different reasons, but they often go there looking for something very specific. Maybe it's healing, or it's insight, or it's forgiveness. And in going through the churches of Rome and making so many pilgrimages around that city, I started to see too how it's not just the end goal, but of course, as many a hippie bumper sticker would say, it's the journey itself that
Hmm.
is that
Hmm.
is the thing we're after. And I think there is a certain truth in that too. So there's an end goal that you're after, maybe, but it's also a willingness to let go of your presuppositions and maybe even the end goal itself at certain points in order to allow the journey itself to transform you. And I think for me, I began to discover and hopefully captured some of this in the book itself, um, how in the process of going through the journey where it's much more open-ended, when you learn to let go of even what it is you thought you needed, even what your end goal may be, you discover that the transformation that takes place on the pilgrimage is sometimes the end goal you were searching for all along. Not to necessarily find some resolution that we ourselves had planned on or predicted or deeply sought after, but that in the relinquishment or letting go of the desire itself for that end goal, for wholeness or fullness or however we want to view it, we actually find what we needed along the way. And so I'm trying to reimagine pilgrimage as a complicated and complex process of letting go of some of our presuppositions while also discovering something very deeply profound and transformative while doing that. And that's, again, that I to hark back on what I was saying a moment ago, but that's why, like, I think someone can say I'm going to go on a pilgrimage even though I'm not a religious person, and there's something profoundly powerful about that takes place. It's a person, as I put it in the book, it's like a willingness to take your unbelief and lay it at the feet of belief, and to discover that there's something powerfully transformative in that process. It may not look like what you think it is, like, oh, now I discovered I have total belief in whatever, but it's actually a process of allowing yourself to let go of even that staunch position of unbelief, and to say, I'm willing to actually be much more open to mystery, which is, translated in the Catholic world by sacrament. I'm much more willing to be open to the mystery of life before me, or of God, or of the church, or of myself, or of the other person before me, than I ever realized I could be. And so I think that for me was a big piece of trying to work through various definitions of pilgrimage as a liminal space in your life, or whatever you want to phrase it as. But I was trying to make all these definitions, again, hold the tension between competing ideas of what it is, in order to allow us to be shaken, let go of what it is we thought it was, and then to rediscover something very profound and new about ourselves along that way.
Hmm. For sure. Do you think there can be like anything, any kind of like spiritual dangers or temptations about pilgrimage? Like, do you think that it can perhaps sometimes be indulgent or even like a little bit escapist, like sort of this flight from kind of the entanglements of our everyday lives? And if there is that temptation, like how does that kind of balance out with kind of what you're talking about, this sort of spiritual insight, right? A sense of like personal meaning that pilgrimage can offer us?
Yeah, it's such a great question. These are the kinds of questions that get me most excited because, as I'm always telling
Nice.
my students, there's temptation to take a wrong turn at every moment. Like,
Hmm.
yes, to everything you just said, I would simply say yes, of course. Like, there are absolutely temptations in pilgrimage to see yourself as holier than thou, as more pious than even the person next to you. Temptations to inflate your own ego through the hardships you're enduring. Temptations to, as you put it, to be indulgent, to say, I'm going to bask in this sort of spiritual glow of something. I never want to go back to the real world. But again, all these things are let's say they're very individually based as
Hmm.
possibilities. I mean,
Hmm.
I would very much endorse the idea that all of us could be tempted at any point in our lives to take a wrong turn. And so it's not that I want to develop some sort of scrupulous vigilance that you have to watch yourself at every given moment like a
Right.
tormented conscience. Um, but that was, some people say that's how Luther started the Reformation, right? I mean, like, he was so tormented by his excessive scrupulosity. I
Mm-hmm.
fear that I'm going to do wrong at every turn. That he kicks off the Reformation as a response. I think for some people, yeah, there's this uh, temptation to bear guilt and to beat themselves up for things. But I do think it is true. We can actually, yeah, be tempted to look at pilgrimage and to embrace it in the wrong kinds of ways. But hopefully, the process of pilgrimage becomes, for people who undertake it, say with some sort of seriousness or spiritual intent, is to realize, yeah, pilgrimage should be a helpful thing to help you see where it is you're tempted to do these things wrongly, or to hold it wrongly, to use it wrongly. But then it should also be a time to let go of all that and say, no, I'm just too tired to even to distort the
Yeah.
reality of the truth before me. And I'll say it this way too. I think that's why pilgrimage is such a beautiful thing, because people who undertake it, I think with the right intentions, they are just, you know, worn out by the end of the day. Like, you're physically drained. You think of people who do the Santiago de Compostela, right? You walk the Camino maybe for a month, and you're just like, I'm physically not able to deceive myself in the way that I normally would. And in doing that, we get stripped down to our bare minimum, right? The presuppositions fly out. And then we say, okay, I've let go of so much. I'm not trying to be anything right now, or to pretend to be something to someone else. I'm just more authentically me right now. And I think in those moments, that's where we discover how pilgrimage can become a transformative process. I think it's also why I've talked to so many people recently, even just recently, one of my sons, my son's a freshman at SLU, and he was having a weekend for dads at the fraternity. And
Nice.
one of the other dads, who actually is at Gonzaga, um, he was saying he and his son had hiked, the Camino together. And like, there was the sense of so many people going there who they're not necessarily religious, but there's something deeply powerful and transformative about doing the pilgrimage, doing the hike, letting go of everything they thought was important, and then rediscovering something else profoundly, important within them. And so I hope, to sort of go back to answering your question, I hope that the experience of pilgrimage can be so physically embodied that the person is able to let go of any of those temptations, to do just as you said, to indulge or to misread it or to allow it to be something that's not or whatever. And then you slowly, hopefully even physically begin to retrain yourself into a space of accountability that's very, very different and maybe much more easier to hold, let's say, at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, would you say pilgrimage is like requires some level of like solitude or quiet? Like, um, is it sort of something where you kind of need maybe like a little bit of space to be able to kind of enter that more reflective, meditative? Like, is it kind of like a spiritual retreat on steroids? Is that how you would sort of describe it?
It's a great question. So when I was talking to the dad and his son about hiking the Camino, they were really emphasizing, and I think wonderfully, the communal aspect. It's so
Hmm.
nice to meet different people and to feel like you're part of something bigger than yourself with others. And I never want to discount or downplay how the communal aspect is so important. And there are pilgrimages that take place all over the world constantly that are communally based, right? Our whole church is going to make this pilgrimage together.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Celebrate mass at the site, and so I think that is a wonderful part of the experience. But I will say the way I focus the book, and I'm writing it sort of for this audience primarily, but not exclusively. Yes, is for people who are sort of wanting to look at pilgrimage as also a solitary experience, something where they're going, or let's say retreating into the silence in order to find something interiorly that often we can't grasp in our world that's so busy, so noisy, so full of technological distractions and so many
Hmm.
other things. I was writing the book with that in mind and very much suggesting that to truly undertake a pilgrimage in the sense I was talking of it, you do have to find a way to encounter solitude. So, for example, and I don't think I say this directly in the book, but if someone came to me and said, "What's the best way to experience a pilgrimage in Rome?" I would say, "Go do it by yourself. Like, don't
Hmm.
don't go there, with this idea of me and my best friends are gonna we're gonna eat these lavish lunches and then we're just gonna drink a lot of wine. Then we're gonna walk to a church here or there." I think all that can be wonderful, and I don't want to downplay that. And again, it's a fuzzy border between the tourist and the pilgrim sometimes, and that goes
Hmm.
back to the history of the pilgrim, not just
Yeah.
today. Um, but I would also say there's something powerful about doing it by yourself, walking the streets by yourself, having to avoid the crowds by yourself, having to think about things, and to put your body through space in a way that is absolutely powerful because you're not being inundated with technology or conversation or all kinds of other distractions that could possibly be lurking around every corner too. And I think that when you enter a church in solitude and quiet and there's no one else around or just a few other people here and there, it can be a deeply transformative experience to not be surrounded by other people. And that is part of what I experienced too in my in my research and in my going through Rome for this book. I was doing this pretty much almost always by myself. There were moments where I was with other people, and I do note some of that in the book, but for the most part, I was by myself. And I think that process is one that's painful for a lot of people. It's hard to do. Just a couple nights ago, I was at a dinner with undergrads, and one of them asked this priest about some, music, and he talked about how he really, at certain moments he doesn't like to listen to music. And she was like, "Well, how do you fill the silence? Don't you have to have something to fill the silence?"
Hmm.
And it was a moment for him to be like, well, there are moments you need to embrace the silence. And that's the definition
Yeah.
of where spirituality begins. So long answer there.
Yeah.
Sorry, but that's kind
No,
of one
no.
I would begin, yes, it should be an entering into silence voluntarily in order to encounter your spirit and spirituality in general.
Sure, sure. So for someone who might be more attracted to nature than to church architecture, church history, I mean, could we do you think we could sort of describe, like, I know you're a fly fisher, right? Aren't you?
Yes.
Okay. So could we describe something like a fly fishing trip or a backpacking trip, some kind of like immersion in nature? Does that have similarities with sort of the way you're describing pilgrimage?
So I didn't get a chance to fully develop this in this book because the book was focused more on like pilgrimage, the Catholic understanding of it, and Rome and its history and the churches,
Right.
etc.
Right.
And for that reason, then pilgrimage has a deep tie to the symbols, stories, narratives, mystical traditions, however you want to phrase it, that are part of a specific cultural and religious phenomenon. I think I say that because nature appears to a lot of us as something somewhat devoid of that same symbolic network of meaning. But at the
Hmm.
same time, what it does do is something powerfully transformative that strips us of sort of all the markers and identities and designators that come along with culture or religion. And for that reason, yes, it can be a powerful, profound experience that is very much akin to pilgrimage, to be immersed in nature in these kinds of ways. I love that. I love that analogy. I do think it's very different in a sense too, because it doesn't have the same history of writings and symbols and
Yeah.
people talking
Yeah.
about it, like things that are on your mind specifically as you sit and look at a mosaic in the apse of a church, that deals with a particular biblical story and that helps you think through some aspect of life differently. That's going to be a very different cultural and symbolic experience than going into nature where we sort of have to drop all of the representations of ourselves. But I would say the two are certainly not exclusive. I mean, this is
Mhm.
they can work wonderfully and powerfully in concert with each other in order to give us a strong and unified sense of what pilgrimage can be. So I would love to write, part two. Here's what
Yeah.
it's like to experience pilgrimage in nature. And I do teach courses on nature and spirituality. So I think this through all
Hmm.
the time. And I love hiking and camping and fishing and all that stuff. Belden Lane's books would be wonderful
Yeah.
moments.
Yeah. Yeah.
He brings spirituality and the Christian tradition in dialogue with nature. And I think one of the things I would do is to just emphasize how a quote unquote pilgrimage in nature, whatever that is, I think is something that sort of strips us of everything that's an identifying marker or feature. And that can be, again, a wonderful aspect of what pilgrimage is. But it doesn't have the same symbols, let's say, or
Hmm.
narrative or that cultural piece that is always part of who we are as human beings as well. So I think it can be actually more powerful sometimes for some people, especially in the secular
Yeah.
world, where they realize I go to nature because it allows me to drop all the culture, period.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that can be refreshing and rejuvenating in such powerful ways, especially now that technology has sort of taken over so much of our lives. I think we need to get away from it sometimes. And that can be a great way to do that. But I do think, yeah, pilgrimage in a specific religious context is also just such a powerful feature of who we are as humans. But it definitely relates to symbolic worlds and scriptural worlds and communal worlds in ways that nature or experiences of pilgrimage in nature can't really replicate.
Sure. Yeah. No. Yeah. I like what you said there. I think nature can definitely have that sort of way of like um, forcing us into like this existential nakedness almost, where
Yeah,
like you said, right? They can be a very powerful experience and make you feel very small, but in a way that leads you to a sense of awe, maybe. Um, I want to.
completely. Well, can I just have one more thing? I would say
Yeah. Of course. Go ahead.
that's part of the. I did write about this in the book, and I think that's part of the beautiful contrast, but also comparison between nature and religious pilgrimage. You do get a feeling when you enter into some huge cathedrals, like they're
Right.
so large they physically dwarf you, and it's an overwhelming but beautiful and almost like sublime experience of, oh my God, look at how small I am in comparison to this. It's radiant in its
Mhm.
spaciousness, and that feeling I get too when I'm in the mountains. Like I'll enter a
Yeah.
mountain, and it's
Yeah.
like, wow, I'm overcome by the grandeur and the size of these mountains and how they absolutely dwarf me. There's definite parallels there that fascinate me.
Sure, sure. Yeah, absolutely. I want to kind of turn to something we haven't talked too much about yet, but I think is a significant thread, a major thread in the book, right? So it's this sort of like sense of divine absence, right? Especially as that might be experienced for someone who's on pilgrimage. So could you say something about kind of your own experience of atheism while you've been on pilgrimage in Rome in particular?
Yeah, I think, for me, it's taken so many different forms. So there's not like one specific way I try to categorize the experience I have.
Sure.
But there's so many moments where, yeah, I'll find myself being maybe more detached or withdrawn from certain things than I would like to be. And so, like, in the book, I write about having a moment of sitting in a convent while they're going through their daily prayers, and then they're praying the rosary, and people come in, local people most likely, who are praying with them, praying the rosary with them. And I'm sitting in the back, writing about the experience, which is partly an academic thing to do, to sit with a
Mhm.
certain detachment. But it's also someone who struggles with faith and says, I'm not sure exactly what this is to me. But then there are moments where I go into other pilgrimage spaces, or while I'm going through a pilgrimage, I'm walking between sites, and I'm having moments that I would characterize as more or less, quote unquote, spiritual experiences or religious experiences, where I'm feeling something drop from me, a certain weight that I was carrying. And the experience is profound enough that I would label it as something like an encounter with that which is much greater than me, that is more mysterious and I don't understand. And that's okay. I don't have to understand this, even what's happening to me or transpiring. And I think most of my experiences range somewhere between the two, right? That I'm not always able to identify or describe what it is I go through. But then when I talk to people who are deeply religious, they're not able to do so either sometimes.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's okay, because I know what it's like to also be a religious person who can't fully describe my experience. So I, I find myself feeling good about the honesty of admitting that there are times where I struggle with belief. And then I find myself also saying, gosh, I really wish I could have profound, deep encounters with the divine or that which is greater than me. And I'm not giving those desires up. I'm not stopping on those desires. In fact, I feel more open to them the more honest I am about myself and who I am. And I think part of where that leads me to is to say, like, I'm really not comfortable with the label of atheist, even if that's something that I
Yeah.
understand and I can identify with to a large degree. But I'm also not always comfortable with the idea of being a religious believer and whatever that entails. And I think I'm learning as I get older, there's so many more features of our personalities and who we are that also play such a big role in how we understand and describe the faith that we have or that we've claimed we've lost. I was at a meeting in Rome just in February, and I was sitting around a table with some of the great theologians in the world, and we were discussing for a brief period the idea of music. And one of the people doing a presentation wanted us to all sing together a little bit, and I eventually said at some point, I hate choirs and I hate singing. Like, to do this was just so horrible for me. And there were like audible gasps in the room, because I think when you're inherently religious, I think there's this desire for community. There's this desire to become one with the community. There's this desire to lift yourself up in song and be, you know, vocalizing it, and that for some people is such a profound and religious experience. And I think my predispositions are such that I'm like, no, I don't like that. Like, if
Uh-huh.
everyone's joining together for something, I kind of want to get away from all that. And
Mm.
so some of that is just temperamental personality. Like, I
Yeah.
like being secluded and isolated sometimes. And I think that makes me inherently suspicious of some communal endeavors, and religion's part of that. But that doesn't mean I shouldn't take part in those things either. I just have to find my
Yeah.
own way to do that. And so, yeah, that's part of the dynamic I'm trying to be attentive to when I engage in pilgrimage as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that dovetails nicely with the next question. So I'm gonna quote a few sentences from your book. So on page 77, you say, "What I want to isolate within such a dynamic interplay of identities and communities, which is right, kind of what you've been talking about, is the notion that conversion entails a necessary translation from one context to another, which in the end also implicates both contexts. Such an idea intrigues me deeply and gives me some solace too, because I believe it to be true that when you undergo an authentic conversion, whether religious or not, you never really leave behind the place where you came from. Yet you do translate everything into a new idiom and hope you are better off for the effort." So I wonder, how has that sort of phenomenon of carrying this kind of dynamic, complex series of identities and communities within your own person, like how has that looked in your own life? You've shared a bit already about that, but I wonder particularly kind of, as someone yourself who kind of grew up Protestant, right? Grew up the son of a Methodist pastor, and then converting to the Roman Catholic Church, and then kind of now being in kind of a more fluid space. What has it meant for you or looked like for you to kind of hold all of this together within yourself?
Yeah, it's a very powerful thing to me, and I'll skip the the deeper philosophical Hegelian commentary on how I think dialectics work here. But I think
Okay.
this is even my reading of Hegel at some level is like you never fully leave something behind. You never fully transcend and get to a new place, even though you do in so many ways.
Right.
You're always holding a piece of what was before within you still, and you can never fully relinquish that. And I think if you talk to people who are counselors or talk to a psychotherapist, I think this is a basic thing we all should strive for is like greater psychic health, which is to say, I want to get to a space where I don't, just get angry when I think about some experience from my past, where I don't just resent something and hold on to that and become bitter. I want to get to a place of peace where I say, even, the good, the bad, I hold on to these things and I look at them fondly, even if there's something that at one point in my life they had deeply traumatized me or made me angry. I mean, I think the goal here for all of us is to find a peace that promotes a wholeness, where we say, I know I had these experiences that I wish I hadn't, but I want to learn to see them in such a helpful way that it gives me peace, it guides me, and that I'm accepting of them in a way that I never thought I could be. So for me, I think this is also my reading of the relationship between, let's say, faith and the lack of faith. I don't feel like I have to get to a place anymore where I say I've got a firm grasp on one or the other, because I think, when I teach my atheism classes, this is the most obvious thing we encounter time and again. So many people who claim to be atheists do so because they were hurt by religion.
Yeah.
They were deeply disaffected in some way, and they wanted to run away or, be accusatory, or let's take the whole thing down because I hate it. And it's like, that's never a healthy project for anyone,
Mm.
to approach a critique because you're angry. And I think we have to get to a space where we say, I'm beyond these labels in a good way, a healthy way. I'm willing to adhere to them if they are helpful for others, if they allow me to commune with another person because they realize we share something in common. That's great. But at the same time, there are always going to be these reductive labels that never do justice to the fullness of who I am or who anybody else is. And I need to allow that to also speak to my situation and context. So I love, looking at the idea of faith and the lack of faith and saying, I don't care anymore to identify with one or the other, to be reactionary. I'd love to embrace both, as they both have characterized my life, my past, everything that I've been part of. And I'm not angry at the church or angry at
Yeah.
atheists or, I'm not. I want to sit and listen and learn and relish and delight, but also realize I'm here for the most important thing, which is, to encounter myself and the other before me in a way that promotes the flourishing and the health of us all. And I
Mm.
think that to me is the most important piece of this recognition.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So, I mean, kind of looking at kind of more of the geography of the book, right? Because that's such an important part of the book. So, what is kind of the importance of the city of Rome, in particular, to the story that you're telling in this book, and then for you especially, what has Rome meant to you as a site of spiritual pilgrimage?
Yeah, so many things. I mean, in the Catholic faith, of course, if you've never been to Rome, it can be very eye-opening for a lot of people to be like, wow, Catholicism is alive and well. It is flourishing here. Like
Mm,
I'm
mhm,
seeing priests and nuns on most streets. I'm
mhm,
encountering people going to mass, and I can think of so many times I've encountered busloads of pilgrims from, particular national contexts, especially Poland, going into a church and just really demonstrating so well that faith can be alive and vibrant in people's lives. But I would say personally, I went there on my honeymoon back in early 2000s, and
mhm,
it's been a spot that I've returned to so many times for conferences, for teaching, for vacation. And so it had taken on a very significant space in my personal life that was impossible to ignore for me.
mm,
And when I went through a divorce many years later, that also added another layer of memory and history to the city, and thinking of all the times I'd been there, while married with my
sure.
child, watching
Mhm.
my son play soccer with boys in the midst of a piazza. They couldn't speak the same language, but they could certainly speak the language of soccer together. And all these memories, all this history in one particular place sort of came together as very important to me, very central to who I am. But also, yeah, it's the heart of Catholicism and what Catholicism's faith is historically. So, my personal experience has been that bringing those forces together in one place like Rome was a very important space for me to then examine myself and my narrative, my life, and my own legacy. Um, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, no, yeah, that's great. Something you bring up a good bit in the book, and you mentioned it earlier too, actually, is this sort of phenomena you've encountered in your trips to Rome, of this kind of really striking polarity between like the consumerism or the capitalism of this place, but then also juxtaposed with this like really thick religious and spiritual history, and it being a place of pilgrimage, right? So what has your own experience of kind of this polarity been like when you've been to Rome in general, but especially to Rome as a pilgrim?
Yeah, there are a couple of things that spring first to mind that are more historical. One is that Catholicism has always been a messy religion, which is part of what I
Yeah.
love. There's never a clear cut sense of we're only going to do pilgrimage here. We're not going to do touristy things. No, they're Catholics, so it's messy. So everything's kind of bleeding together at times, and that's okay. That's part of what it's about. It's not something they're going to strike a strong pose against. And the second thing is that literally is part of the history of pilgrimage. So the moment you have pilgrims going to Jerusalem, going to the Holy Land, you begin to develop for the first time in history passports, papers to grant travel, safe travel for pilgrims between different lands. You also have some pilgrims going down there and saying, "Ooh, we like these spices and these silks and these various things we're finding. We're going to buy a lot of those and bring them back and sell them at home." And even though the intentions start out with more religious than tourist or financial economic, the line starts to blur at certain points, and you're not quite sure:
Yeah.
are we going there for pilgrimage or are we going there for economic gain? And it's not always clear. And so I think that's always been, part of the Catholic spectacle of pilgrimage, for better for worse. And I certainly don't want to deny that. For me personally, I think Rome is such a great embodiment of this tension, because when you go there, I mean, it's more tourists than pilgrims these days, and yet the pilgrims are still bountiful. And if you want to be a pilgrim, or even a secular pilgrim, or a tourist with more intention, than most,
Mhm.
to find depth and meaning within yourself, you're having to discern and negotiate these things nonstop. And I
Mhm.
write about this in the book. There was one wonderful close to evening, when the church was still open, where I was near some shops, and I was, hearing the diners at restaurants, and just there's a loud ruckus on the streets. And then I sneak into a side church right there on the busy street with restaurants, and it's quiet. I could hear a
Mm.
little bit of noise out there, but not too much. And that to me was a powerful moment of recognition to myself that even in the midst of all this chaos and busyness, the Catholic Church makes a space available for the silence. They make a space available for God. They make a space
Mhm.
available for encounter, um, in the midst of all the craziness. And Rome
Mhm.
really does embody that tension so well today, because the city's, yeah, it's tourist crazy. I mean, it's,
Mhm.
it's
Yeah.
everywhere you go, there's something to be bought, there's something to be seen. And yet the church doesn't shy away from that or back away from that. And I love too how Pope Francis made very clear we're not going to start charging money for people to enter the churches of Rome. They come here, for spiritual purposes too. They're not just tourists. And I think that to me was such a wonderful sign that I wish more European cathedrals would follow, especially the ones in Belgium that are annoying the hell out of me with this. Because a lot of churches, they become more museums, not
Yeah.
actual places that people go into for religious reasons. And that to me is very sad. I find that a tragic situation. And in that sense, I could see how a more secular museum atmosphere has sort of taken away something that was available to everyone before. So I'm not a fan of the charging fees to walk into churches, because I think they offer such a wonderful testament to what it is that church is actually about. It's making that space available to everyone to learn something more about the depths of our own humanity. And we need that more
Yeah.
than ever now.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's a good place for us to close. I want to give you the chance as we finish up to share about any kind of work you have in progress, anything you might like to share about here. I know you're always busy writing.
I am. I love it. A lot of fun. Yeah, there's always something. Let's see. I recently did publish a book on atheism and love that's coming out in paperback, I believe, this fall. And there I talk about very much the blurring of boundaries between sort of spiritual practices, like mystical practices of indifference, and cultivating an indifference as love. That love allows you to truly not be tied to things in a way that a lot of us might consider unhealthy, but we're actually freed. And when we're freed through a practice of indifference, a spiritual practice of indifference, we actually are able to love others even better. And I find that to be a common ground with atheism, because you're going to see in a lot of atheist writings, they talk about cultivating an indifference toward faith as the only real proper response to faith, which I agree with. Like if you're really not hurt by what religion does, or you're not just reacting with resentment or anger, then your true position on religion should be sort of an indifference. It could be here or not be here, I don't care. And when you read atheists who say that, you realize there's something profoundly overlapping here with the mystical spiritual traditions that also try to cultivate a practice of indifference as a way toward loving others. And so I read about that in that book, in order to try and stress there's a lot more common ground here than we often realize. And that does overlap with a lot of the themes I use in this book on pilgrimage, even though the book on pilgrimage is much more accessible and hopefully easily understandable.
Sure.
The book on atheism and love is a little more philosophical, but I would say it's also hopefully accessible. And people can get into that if they want. So that's one that I worked on, recently, and it'll be coming out in paperback in the fall. And then I'm also, sometime in the next year, I got a book coming out from SUNY Press, and that's going to be on the concept. This one gets philosophical very fast. It's on the concept of redoubling in the context of metaphysics, and redoubling would be like when we talk about the being of beings, or God of gods, or the thought of thought. So we're redoubling the idea, and I talk about how those are often an attempt to establish a sovereign position, a position that can't be touched, like the ultimate, like the man of men, things like that. And then I talk about how in mystical traditions you have the opposite, which is a negation of negation, and you have all these theologians who write about the annihilation of annihilation, or the division of division, and all these negative redoublings that actually are intended to counter any attempt to be sovereign. And you see this throughout the history of metaphysics. Theologians and philosophers alike, they're always redoubling their concepts in order to either establish a profound position or to take it apart. And I was curious that there were really there's not much out there of people saying, can we talk about why people redouble concepts and what that is done for and what they're trying to accomplish with that. So even though it's a very philosophical book, I do find it fascinating because people don't really talk about redoubling openly and talk about, what is this about and why did we do this?
Yeah, for sure. No, those both sound fascinating. Okay, so for listeners, again, just one more time, the title of the book we've been talking about today is Sacred Pilgrim, Secular Pilgrim, A Roman Journey. Be sure to grab a copy. I'll leave a link in the show description for you as well. But Colby, thank you so much for chatting today. This was a lot of fun.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for your great questions. Those were so wonderful.